So, a lot of people have been asking me lately, and by a lot of people, I mean one, about my opinions and speculations about what the Submachine series holds for us in the future. And it's been 12 years since the first game, and since then we've had the completion of the main series and a bunch of side games as well. And now we have two more confirmed side games to look forward to in the future, which are Submachine the Engine and Submachine the Explorers. And in case anyone's wondering, I set a precedent on the Submachine wiki to abbreviate these as Sub-E and Sub-X, respectively, because they just felt natural to do it like that. But before I can touch on either of these games, I can't go without mentioning the untitled Big Game. This is going to be Mateusz Skutnik's first release on Steam, and if I remember correctly, he wants it to be big enough to compare to games such as those released by game company Amanita Design, who is responsible for the Samorost series of games, as well as Machinarium and Botanicula. Both pretty good games. I'm speculating that this big game will be about the size of all parts of Samorost combined, which again, if I remember correctly, will make for a complete storyline, but not necessarily as big as Machinarium or Botanicula. And I think this is a good size because it'll probably be large enough to have an impact on the Steam community, as the right people do love the different parts of Samorost for what it's worth. But it's still small enough that it's not too big of a project to start off with, as after all, this is Mateusz's first big project in GameMaker. I'm not saying he needs a lot of help and therefore will have it on the smaller side, especially since he has years of experience with Flash, but you know these things progress naturally one step at a time. No offense meant in any part of that. But this takes us into Submachine the Engine. First things first, when I think it will come out. The last I heard, it's originally slated for some release during 2018, but I think at this point, since we're already in November of 2017, that 2018 as a whole might be too early. Matt has made it clear that he wants the big game to hit Steam and build his reputation there before introducing a new Submachine game, and I wouldn't expect the big game to come out until at the very earliest, late 2018. So I'm willing to speculate that we can expect the engine to be released somewhere around maybe mid-2019. Now that seems a bit far off, I know, but there is something that might make this come a little bit quicker. Matt's creation philosophy dictates that he doesn't like working on just one project at a time, because if he hits a creative block, he likes to be able to turn to other projects in the meantime, so he's always working on something. So there is the possibility that he might choose to work on at least certain elements of Submachine the Engine at the same time that he's working on the big game. Now, enough about dates and deadlines, let's talk about what I think these games are actually going to be about. Here's what I've been able to gather about Submachine the Engine. When it was originally posted as a Patreon goal, the description read, "First of the standalone Submachine companion games, explaining a bit more about the world and the mystery. This game will be about the machines themselves without the context of Murtaugh or other main storyline elements." The game was later removed from the list of Patreon goals and then re-added later with a different description. This one reading, "First of submachines to be created after the singularity, meaning finishing of the main series. There are still questions surrounding the world of Submachine, and we can answer them in these games." And actually, as I write this, I'm noticing that the description has been updated yet again, since when I don't know, but now it says, "This will be a completely new game in the series, created for PC and Mac, and hopefully released on Steam." So we have these three different descriptions to look at, and while they certainly seem like updates of each other, meaning that the more recent ones are probably more important, I can't help but wonder at Matt's thought process behind each of these words. In other words, nothing that we haven't been doing already for the past 12 years without barely getting any answers. He does call this game the first post-singularity game, which I don't actually think is that important in this context. It really just seems like yet another cool term that he's thrown in there for us to ask questions about. Well, I'm not biting. However, what's more interesting to me is this line from the first description, "First of the standalone Submachine companion games." I'm assuming this means one of two things. Either A, this is some sort of chronological first installment to the standalone games that we've seen before, those being 32 Chambers, FLF, and Ancient Adventure, or B, companion game means something that's related to the world of Submachine, but maybe even more so removed from the main series than the aforementioned side games are. Maybe this is a start of another side series. Who knows? But this does seem to be supported by the newest description that says this will be a completely new game in the series. I don't really know. But let's talk actual subject material. The placeholder image for Submachine the Engine has, for a long time, been one of the screens from the Clockwork Room, coordinate 642, full of gears and other mechanical parts. Now it's the screen from 840, which is in the most recent Submachine update. This lends credibility to the assumption that where we're going to find ourselves in this game is going to be very mechanically based, sort of like Submachines 3 or 6, where a lot of the work was done with puzzles and system integration instead of relying heavily on items and their placement. And as to where this is going to take place, I'm assuming we'll be seeing once again a completely new environment, environment and not revisiting parts of old locations, at least not parts that we've really seen before. Perhaps it'll be a part of the defense system that has a lot more controls and just stuff than we've previously been exposed to, or a part of Shiva that's more complex than the relatively simple interface that we ran across in Sub 10. Because, I have a really hard time believing that what we saw in Sub 10 was, that was, the core thing of Shiva. I mean, I know that there were wires and stuff all over the place, but things seemed a little bit too simple. So maybe there's more to that than we've seen before. Or it might be alluding to the very beginnings of the route, with the possible original power generator that we probably saw in one of the tile rooms in Sub 10. Whatever questions this game wants to answer, I think they're going to be connected to the base functions of the subnet and how it all works, rather than things about the people in it. And as such, like the other standalone games, I don't expect too many notes will be present for us to collect, if any, and that also falls in line with games that play like Submachine 3 or 6. And yes, I'm aware that Sub 6 especially had a bunch of notes, but most of them weren't contained in the actual defense system, they were more in the surrounding areas, like the tunnels, sewers, whatever you want to call them. Call them tunnels, that's the correct term. So those are my thoughts on Submachine the Engine, a game that's going to explore some of the more fundamental concepts of the subnet itself through a very methodical, game logic heavy style, like that in the system, or through more actual puzzles like in Sub 3, rather than just simple item manipulation. Now let's talk about Submachine the Explorers. I'm not going to even bother tagging a release date onto this one, and honestly it's rather difficult for me to really speculate on the nature of this one at all, because we know even less about this one than we do the engine. However, I think it's second nature to assume that in contrast to the engine and the other side games so far, this one will probably be full of lore in the form of notes and possibly other forms of forgotten communication, maybe that he'll make up in the future for us to marvel at. Obviously, the first game that springs to mind to compare this to is Submachine 4 The Lab, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the Explorers took a similar form to that game. I'm assuming the lore will talk more about how the exploration teams came to be, some background on the lab complex, and in combination with the locations discovered where they were able to reach. Maybe the notes will also deal a bit more with the mentality of the members themselves, and perhaps we'll find some documents that introduce specific team members and build little personalities around them. I mean, this is all entirely speculation, but, it'd be cool to see. As for the question of whether or not we will actually find any explorers, I think that's probably a no. I don't expect Mac to radically change the style of the Submachine games to have live characters in it, to the extent that we might see in games like Covert Front or Daymare Town. So at very best, I'll say that if we do come into contact with any explorers, they'll be dead at best. Sorry for the less than positive outlook, but that's how I see it. That's pretty much all I have as far as my thoughts on what these two games will be about. Ultimately, Matt might watch this video and decide, well, no, I'm not going to do any of that. And that seems to be one of his trains of thought that he follows, and trust me, I'll talk about that along with some other things that are related in a later video. But for now, if you have any thoughts of your own or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or post about them on the forum as well.